There is a woman in every man's memory he has never fully explained. Not the most accommodating one, not necessarily the most beautiful, not even the one who loved him most openly, but the one who, without any visible effort, made him feel he had to rise just to stay in her presence. He might be with someone else now. He might have moved countries, changed careers, started over entirely. But she is still there, somewhere in the background of his mind, surfacing in quiet moments. A particular kind of afternoon light, a song he doesn't skip, random Tuesday when nothing is wrong, but something feels missing. He cannot fully account for it. He does not try. Simply knows she was different. What made her different? We are surrounded by noise on this topic. Articles, reels, podcasts, entire industries built around the idea of making yourself more desirable. How to text when not to text. How to seem interested without seeming too interested. How to be confident but not intimidating. Warm but not desperate. Beautiful but not vain. The rules pile up until the woman underneath them has been completely buried, replaced by a version of herself that was assembled to pass a test, never had a correct answer. And somewhere in the middle of all that noise, something essential gets lost. Not a strategy, not a technique, something far more important than either of those themselves. The cruelest irony of all the love advice that exists is that the single most seductive thing a woman can carry has nothing to do with any of it. It has nothing to do with her outfit, her response time, carefully engineered distance she creates to spark his interest. It has nothing to do with playing hard to get, a concept so consistently misunderstood that it has ended more promising connections than it has ever created. What I am about to share with you is not a trick, not a formula. It is something older and more honest than any technique. And once you understand it, not intellectually, but in your body, the way you make decisions, something will change in you that cannot be reversed. Because what makes a woman genuinely, quietly, almost dangerously seductive is not what she does to attract him. It is what she refuses to give up to keep him. Before we go any further, we need to pull apart a belief so deeply embedded in the way women are raised that most people have never thought to question it. The belief is this: in order to be loved and to sustain that love, a woman must make herself as easy to be with as possible, as gentle, as agreeable, consistently available, and uncomplicated as she can manage. She should not push back too hard. She should not inconvenience him. She should respond warmly and quickly. She should fold her preferences into his. She should make loving her feel like the path of least resistance. What happens to the women who follow this? They become, in the quiet language of a man's subconscious, predictable. And predictability, however comfortable it feels in the early weeks, is the silent destroyer of sustained desire. Desire does not live in comfort alone, lives in the tension between what you have and what you are not fully certain you will keep, lives in the space between closeness and the awareness that closeness is not guaranteed. This tension cannot be manufactured artificially. You cannot perform it, fake it, or schedule it into a week. But you can, this is the point that changes everything. Live in a way that creates it naturally and honestly. Women who do this are not running a strategy. They are not consulting a playbook between text messages. They are simply so genuinely invested in their own lives, their own growth, their own sense of direction, their own interior world, that their time and attention carry actual weight. That weight is what creates the pull, not manipulation. Wait, stay with me, because what comes next is where this gets specific and important. To understand why this dynamic works, you have to understand something real about the way attraction forms and sustains itself in the male mind. I want to do this without reducing men to cartoons, because the truth is more nuanced and more interesting than the caricatures. Beneath the surface of most men's behavior in relationships, there is a tension they may never name out loud, quiet contradiction that drives enormous amounts of their emotional life. On one side sits the desire for peace, for ease, for a relationship that feels like a warm room to come back to, consistent, calm, without constant uncertainty. This is the part of him that wants to rest in something, that finds safety genuinely appealing. Pressing hard against that desire is something older and far less comfortable to acknowledge. Part of him that does not respond to ease the way he thinks he should. The part that, when something is handed to him too completely, finds itself subtly withdrawing, not cruelly, not intentionally. But there is a mechanism in the human brain, in all human brains, not just men, that assigns higher value to what requires genuine effort to obtain. We are not drawn to what comes freely, drawn to what we had to reach for. This is not a character flaw. It is not something to resent. It is basic human psychology. Things we have worked for feel more precious than the things that were simply placed in our hands. And here is the costly error that well-meaning, deeply loving women make every day. In an attempt to secure his love, to make absolutely certain he will not leave, they remove the very thing that gives them weight in his mind. They collapse every distance. They become entirely available, entirely agreeable, entirely organized around his schedule and preferences. And the relationship, which once crackled with something alive, begins to go quiet, not because he stopped caring, not because she stopped being wonderful, but because the dynamic has shifted in a way neither of them consciously planned. She has made loving her feel like a guarantee rather than a gift. And guarantees, however precious they sound in theory, do not hold the same emotional charge as a choice that is made and remade freely every single day. Let me put this in concrete terms, because abstraction without reality is useless. Think of two women. These are not fictional characters. They are patterns you have likely witnessed. Perhaps you have inhabited one of them at different points in your own life. The first woman loves him genuinely and deeply. She is generous with her time, her warmth, her emotional availability. When he goes quiet for a day, her anxiety rises and she finds herself reaching for the phone. When he seems distracted, she wonders immediately what she might have done. She rearranges her weekend around his schedule. She softens her opinions on things she actually cares about, just to keep the conversation easy. She says yes when the honest answer might be a maybe. She does all of this because she loves him, because she has been taught 1,000 subtle ways that love is demonstrated through accommodation. The second woman also cares deeply, but she operates from a completely different internal foundation. When he is unavailable, turns her attention back toward her own life. The project she is building, the book she is in the middle of, friendship she has been meaning to give more time to. Not as a strategy, not because she is performing indifference, because her interior world is genuinely interesting to her, and it does not pause just because he is not in the room. When he is inconsistent, she notices. She addresses it, simply, without drama, without the edge of accusation. Just clarity. She does not restructure her plans around someone who has not committed to theirs. She does not perform excitement she does not feel. She does not disappear her opinions to protect the smoothness of an evening. And what happens? He thinks about her in a way that surprises him, not because she has made herself artificially unavailable, not because she has studied some technique, but because she is the first woman who has made him feel that her presence in his life is something remarkable, something she has chosen and could unchoose. The distinction between something given and something chosen is one of the deepest drivers in all of human psychology. We do not treasure what we simply received. We treasure what we had to demonstrate ourselves worthy of receiving. Here is where the real depth of this leaves. The layer beneath the layer. There is a difference between a man being charmed by a woman and a man being genuinely, quietly, irrationally haunted by her. He can be charmed by many women. Charm is surface. Charm is good conversation. The right smile at the right moment, easy evening that leaves a pleasant memory. Charm is lovely. Charm is also forgotten by the following Thursday. Being haunted is something else entirely. Being haunted means he carries her with him into the next season, the next relationship, quiet parts of his life where he thought he had moved forward. It means she occupies a space in him that others have not managed to fill, not because she was trying to be unforgettable, but because she was so genuinely and completely herself that she left a real mark. What creates that mark is not physical beauty, though that may have first caught his eye. It is not intelligence or humor, though both matter. It is something more elemental. It is the experience of being in the presence of a woman who is entirely at home in herself. She does not need his reaction to feel good about the way she entered the room. She disagrees with him without apology and agrees with him without flattery. She can sit in silence without filling it with noise. She laughs at things she genuinely finds funny and does not manufacture warmth for things that do not move her. She is real in a world that has taught most people to perform, and authentic, unguarded, wholly unborrowed realness, the willingness to simply be what you are without editing it for reception, is the rarest and most powerful thing one human being can offer another. Now we need to talk about something that most conversations about this subject carefully avoid because it requires looking at something uncomfortable. The reason so many women surrender this power, the power of being genuinely themselves, is fear. Fear of asking for what they actually want and hearing no. Fear of being too much, too specific, too demanding, too real. Fear of pushing back and watching him walk towards someone more agreeable. Fear, most of all, of being alone. This fear is not irrational, is not weakness. It is the rational result of growing up in a world that has consistently, quietly communicated that a woman's value is conditional, that she is wanted when she is beautiful enough, sweet enough, uncomplicated enough. Her worth is something she earns through being easy to love. But here is what fear does when you let it navigate your choices in love. It makes you smaller, it makes you quieter, it makes you continuously available, continuously agreeable, continuously adjusting, shrinking yourself to avoid being left. You become a version of yourself that even you struggle to fully recognize. Deepest cruelty of all is that the behavior fear is telling you will keep him is the exact behavior that over time creates the conditions for him to stop seeing you, because something in him registers the shift. Not consciously, not cruelly, he notices when your opinions thin out, when your life contracts around his schedule, when you are always there, always available, always arranged around his convenience. And rather than feeling more secure in the relationship, he feels less intrigued, less aware of what he has. Current weakens. A woman who has lived through that particular ache knows its specific texture. She gave fully and generously and faithfully, felt herself fade into furniture. And the answer, the painful, freeing, deeply worth it answer, is not to learn a better set of techniques. The answer is to come back to yourself. Coming back to yourself means something specific, means building an inner life so full and so genuinely your own that your stability is not dependent on any source outside of you. Means having passions that predate every relationship you have ever been in and would outlast every one you might enter. Means having opinions strong enough that you would hold them warmly but firmly, even in front of someone you are falling for. Means having actual standards, not strategies designed to make him pursue you, but real, personal lines that exist because of who you are and what you know you deserve. And this is not a performance. That distinction is the entire point, because the truth about genuinely magnetic women is that they are not magnetic because they have mastered some technique for appearing self-sufficient. They are magnetic because they are self-sufficient, genuinely, actively, daily. Their attention is not on managing his perception of them. Their attention is on building something worth being part of. That shift from managing appearance to building substance changes the entire quality of the energy they carry. Let me be specific about what this actually looks like in a life, because it is too easy to leave this at the level of inspiration and never bring it to the actual daily texture of a woman's choices. It begins with what we might call a personal direction. Something you are building or growing toward that belongs entirely to you, not because it will make you more attractive, though it will, because a life without direction eventually collapses inward and looks outward to fill what it has not grown itself. Wet. Whether that direction takes the form of a career you are genuinely excited by, a craft you are developing, a body of knowledge you are accumulating, creative work that is slowly coming to life. The form matters far less than the commitment. A woman who has something she is genuinely building is impossible to reduce to a supporting role in anyone else's story. She is already the author of her own. It continues in something we might call the construction of inner stability, a grounded relationship with your own mind that does not require constant external input to stay upright. This is harder than it sounds, because our culture has made chronic distraction the default. But the ability to sit with yourself genuinely and without anxiety, find your own company worthwhile, changes everything about how you move through the world. When his unavailability does not destabilize you, you make different choices, clearer choices, choices from your actual self rather than from the part of you that is afraid. There is a quality that comes from a woman who is comfortable in her own company that is unlike any other energy. She is not in the room searching for someone to complete her. She has already done that work. She is simply here, present, curious, whole. Then there are the boundaries she lives by, not rules she has posted somewhere, not conditions she announces at the beginning of a relationship. Quiet, unmovable set of values that she simply will not negotiate away. How she allows people to speak to her, what she gives her time to, what she accepts and what she does not, regardless of who is asking. These are not weapons, they are not tests. They are the architecture of a woman who respects herself. And the first time a man encounters that architecture, presses gently against it, and feels that it does not move, he does not feel rejected. He feels something that surprises him. He feels the pull of something real, because there is something every emotionally honest man recognizes at some level he may not be able to put into words. There is a difference between a woman who tolerates him and a woman who chooses him. The woman who tolerates him is grateful for his presence and molds herself accordingly. The woman who chooses him has a full life and has made an ongoing, conscious decision that he is worthy of being part of it. Being chosen by someone who has genuine options is an entirely different experience from being kept by someone who feels they have none. A man who has felt the difference between those two things carries that distinction with him forever. Paradox at the center of everything we have discussed is both very simple and very profound. The less you need him to confirm your worth, the more powerfully he wants to be the one standing beside it. The fuller your life is in his absence, the more drawn he is to become part of it. The more rooted you are in your own identity, the more his attention is pulled toward you. This is not because men are contrary. It is not because relationships are games. It is because genuine self-possession is rare. Authenticity, the real kind that was not assembled for an audience, is rare, and we are all, without exception, magnetized by what is genuinely rare. And the last thing, perhaps the most important thing of all, is this. This has never been about him. The woman who carries this energy is not carrying it as a strategy to secure a particular man's attention. She is carrying it because she has made a decision quietly, personally, without announcement, that the life she lives will be one she is proud of, one that reflects who she actually is, without the edits she used to make to be more acceptable. She has stopped making herself smaller. She has stopped performing enthusiasm she does not feel. She has stopped swallowing opinions to avoid friction. She has stopped allowing the fear of being too much to turn her into too little. And in the process of simply consistently, unapologetically becoming herself, she has become exactly the kind of woman a man cannot stop thinking about, not because she planned to be unforgettable, but because she refused to disappear. Look at your own life honestly, not through the lens of what anyone else thinks of you, but through the lens of what you think of yourself. Are you building something that is genuinely yours? Are you honoring the parts of you that have been waiting quietly for permission to fully exist? Are you living in a way you would be proud of, even if no one ever noticed? Because the truth that no relationship can give you and no person can substitute for is this: the most seductive version of you is not a role. It is not a calculated distance or a withheld response or a carefully engineered impression. It is you at your most honest, most grounded, most completely and unapologetically yourself. That woman is not thinking about being seductive. She is too busy being genuinely alive, and that presence, that fullness, that refusal to dim is what stays with someone long after everything else has faded, because she wanted to be remembered, but because she was too real, too full, too entirely her own to be forgotten. something in what we explored today landed somewhere true for you. If you recognized something in yourself that you had almost forgotten was there, then you are already on the path. This is what we do here at Silent Resonance. We go beneath the surface, look at the patterns that quietly shape everything. We talk about the truths that matter. If this is where you belong, subscribe to our channel so you never miss a conversation. We are here every week, and we are glad you found us.